The morning the county assessor came up the road, Nora Voss had 41 horses standing in fog so thick you could lose a hand reaching through it, and every single animal turned its head toward the sound of his wagon at the same instant, like a congregation hearing a bell. He pulled up to the gate, looked out over that pale fog sea of broad backs and heavy shoulders, and took off his hat without quite knowing why he did it. He had come to assess the property value downward on account of the failing operation a neighbor had reported to the county office. He stayed 4 hours, asked to buy a colt before he left, and drove back to town without having lowered a single figure. What he had seen out there in the fog, he told his wife that evening, was not a failing operation. It was the only one of its kind left in the world. 3 years earlier, the whole county would have laughed at that. 3 years earlier, the morning Nora Voss drove a borrowed wagon out to the Pell estate and came back with 8 mares nobody wanted, the town of Harrow. Nebraska said it was the saddest thing they'd seen since the locust year. The mares were big, not elegant big, not the kind of big that makes a man step back in admiration, but deep-chested, raw-boned, mud-colored big, the kind of big that looks like an argument for giving up. Their feet were the size of cookpots. Their necks were so thick and short that from a distance they barely looked like horses at all, more like the idea of horses, blocked out of clay by someone working in a hurry. Nora paid $47 for all 8 of them together, which was less than the price of a decent milk cow, and the man who sold them to her could not fully conceal his relief. They were the last 8 registered mares of a draft breed called the Veltmore, a name so obscure that even the liveryman in Harrow, a man who had named every breed he'd ever touched, had to ask her twice before he stopped shaking his head. The Veltmore horse had come over from the low countries of northern Europe 2 generations before, bred for the deep clay fields of that coastal plain, horses built for pulling through mud and standing all day in cold rain without shivering through their feed. In the open-grass American West, that particular excellence meant nothing. A horse that could stand in mud was not a horse that could run the high plains. Lighter breeds had come and taken the work. The Veltmore had receded from ranch to ranch, generation to generation, until what remained was 8 ancient mares on a bankrupt estate, too old for hard work, too heavy to sell, too stubborn to die, and Nora Voss. She was 23 years old, alone on her father's quarter section after he'd gone into the ground the previous winter, and she had driven out to the Pell estate on a Wednesday in April because old Mr. Pell's great-niece had written her a letter asking if she wanted them before the knacker came. The letter had said, "They are good animals and deserve better than what is coming." Nora had read that line 4 times, then gone to find the wagon. She had been watching those horses for 6 years. When people in Harrow asked why she'd done it, and they did ask, mostly in the tone of a diagnosis, she said only that she had her reasons. What she did not say was that she had spent 6 years watching the Veltmore mares work the Pell fields each spring, and she had seen something in the way they moved through ground that would have mired an ordinary horse to the knee. She had watched them pull through clay that sucked the boots off a man's feet and come up steady and calm and ready for the next row. She had watched their feet, which were wide and frog-padded and placed with an odd rolling precision, and she had understood, without a word for the understanding, the way a child understands something true before language arrives for it, that these animals were not poorly made. They were made for something specific, something most people had stopped valuing, and that the gap between what they were worth and what people thought they were worth was real and large and waiting. She could not have explained this to anyone in Harrow in terms they would have accepted, so she did not try. She just drove out and got the horses. The first week was hard in the arithmetic way that hard things are when you go over the numbers in the dark and the numbers are honest with you. 8 mares, each eating roughly 12 pounds of grain and 30 pounds of hay per day, plus the cost of the farrier who shook his head at those great round feet, but came anyway, plus the fence she needed to extend on the north pasture, plus the mineral blocks, the worming, the liniment for the oldest mare's left hock. Nora sat at the kitchen table her father had built and wrote the numbers in a composition book in her tight, small handwriting, and then wrote them again, as if maybe they would change. They did not change. She had enough to carry them through summer if she was careful. Past summer, she would need a plan. She found her plan in the mud. June came wet that year, the kind of wet that turns Nebraska clay into something between soup and cement, and every farmer in Harrow County was losing days in their fields. Teams were bogging, equipment was mired, the planting calendar was slipping week by week, and the men at the feed store talked of nothing else. Nora harnessed 2 of her mares, the big gray she'd named Elsa, and the younger roan she called Prospect, and drove them to the Kirchner farm 3 miles north, where old Herman Kirchner was standing in his dooryard, staring at a field he couldn't get a team into. She pulled the wagon up, looked at the field, and did not say much. Herman said he had already broken 1 tongue on his cultivator, and his horses were standing in the barn, refusing the job. Nora unhooked the mares from the wagon, set them in the Kirchner field, and let them work. What the Veltmore mares did in clay was not what other horses did. They did not fight it or surge against it. They settled their great weight onto that rolling step gate, the one Nora had watched for years from the fence line of the Pell estate, and they moved through the mired ground as if the ground were merely another surface, slow and implacable and absolutely steady the way a river moves. Herman stood at the edge of the field and watched with his mouth slightly open. By afternoon, 2 rows were done. By sunset, a third. The mares came out of the harness with mud to the knee, breathing easy, ready for more, and Herman Kirchner said a word in German that Nora did not know but understood from the way his hands moved when he said it. He paid her $4 for the day. She drove home and wrote $4 in the composition book. It was not enough to solve anything, but it was proof, and proof was the coin she was really after. The person who understood what Nora was doing before anyone else was Otto Brandt, who farmed the 40 acres adjacent to her father's land, and who had come from Friesland as a boy, and remembered, he said, a horse that looked very much like Nora's mares, working the dike fields when he was small. He was 71 years old, and wore the same gray coat from October to May every year, and he came to her fence one morning in late June, and stood there a long time looking at the mares in the pasture before he spoke. There is a thing people say, he told her, where he came from. He switched briefly into the low, flat vowels of his first language, and then translated for her. The animal that looks like it cannot move is the one that moves everything. He said it as if he were not delivering wisdom, but simply reporting a fact he had observed once and not forgotten. Nora filed it away the way she filed most things that were true, not in words, but somewhere behind the sternum, where useful knowledge lives. Otto began coming by on Saturday mornings. He told her things about the Veltmore breed he had witnessed as a boy, things no book she could find had recorded, that they were unusually cold-resistant and that their broad hooves made them remarkably sure-footed on ice, that they were disinclined to panic, that the mares in particular were long-lived and fertile, well past the age when other breeds had stopped, and that in the old country they had been bred specifically for the spring clay work, because no other horse could match their steadiness in that soil. He told her these things without ceremony, the way a neighbor reports on weather, and Nora listened and wrote things down in her composition book beside the feed figures and the income tally, because she was a person who believed that knowledge and arithmetic belonged in the same ledger. By August, she had worked the mares on 5 neighboring farms and started a waiting list. August arrived like the open door of a furnace, and the creek that cut through the south pasture dropped to a trickle that barely covered the rocks, and Nora came home some days so tired she ate supper standing at the stove rather than bother sitting. She did not complain about this to anyone. She was not the complaining sort. Or rather, she had decided not to be, which is a different thing. What she was tired and calculating, and under both of those things, quietly exhilarated in a way she kept banked low, the way you bank a coal you do not want to waste. The mares were working, the mares were earning, and something else was happening, something she had not fully planned for, but had suspected might. People were watching. She could tell by the way the conversations at the feed store changed when she came in. The mockery was still there, a young woman alone with 8 cart horses. It was still comedic to the town, but there was something beneath it now that had not been there before. People were watching. In September, a man came out from Lincoln. He was a buyer for one of the large agricultural outfitters, a man named Albrecht, who wore a city coat and carried a notebook, and who had heard, he said, from a supplier who had heard from a farmer who had used Nora's mares in a flooded field that there was a draft horse operation in Harrow County doing unusual work. He stood at her fence in his city coat and looked at the mares and said that they were fine-looking animals in the automatic way of a man who has not yet decided whether to be impressed. Then Nora put Else and young Prospect in the traces of a loaded dray. She had borrowed the dray from the feed merchant for the purpose, and drove them across the saturated low corner of her south pasture, the corner that after August's first rains had turned back to the gumbo clay that the creek deposited there every wet season, and she drove them through it twice while Albrecht stood at the fence. The second time through, he had his notebook open and was writing in it. He said, "How many do you have registered?" She said, 8 mares, all of them, and I have 3 foals on the ground from the 3 youngest who are in foal. He said, "Do you have a stallion?" She said, "I am arranging for one." She was not yet arranging for one, but she would be by the time he needed to ask again, and she saw no profit in telling him otherwise. He left without making an offer. She had not expected him to. What she had expected was what happened. He came back in October with a letter of interest from the outfitter for first consideration on any colts she produced over the next 2 years. She did not sign it. She put it in her composition book and went back to work. The child who showed up that October was called Pip. She never learned another name for him, and he never volunteered one. A boy of about 11 who appeared one morning sitting on the top rail of her fence, watching the mares with an expression of complete scientific absorption. She let him sit. The next morning he was there again. The third morning she handed him a bucket and pointed at the water trough, and he climbed down from the fence without a word and got to work. He stayed. He was from somewhere in town, she gathered, a mother who worked at the laundry, a father who was gone, an arrangement of older siblings that left him with time and no particular place to be. He named every one of her horses within his first week. Else and Prospect he accepted because she had named them already, but the other 6 he christened himself with a combination of seriousness and total creative freedom that Nora found she was not able to argue with. The oldest mare, a dark bay with a white blaze who moved with the dignity of an institution, he named Parliament. The others became Biscuit, Morning, Colonel, the Judge, and Lavender, the last being an enormous clay-colored creature who smelled, according to Pip, like something that would turn out to be lavender if you really thought about it. Nora did not press the point. Pip turned out to be extraordinary with horses. He had the still-center quality that the Veltmoor responded to. The breed was not flighty or difficult, but they were attentive, and they noticed fear or hesitation the way a surgeon notices a tremor, and Pip had neither. He would spend an hour simply standing in the pasture, and the mares would drift toward him one by one, the way iron filings drift toward a magnet, until he had all 8 of them arranged around him in a loose circle, and he stood at the middle of it like a small and very satisfied planet. Nora watched this from the fence with something that was close to wonder, and did not say much about it. She paid him in meals and what little she could spare in cash, and he was at the barn before her most mornings, which she did not think was possible, given how early she rose. The winter passed in the manner of Nebraska winters, brutally, and then more brutally, and then, with a 1-week respite in January, that everyone agreed meant nothing, and then with the remainder of the brutality as scheduled. The Veldmoor mares did not appear to notice. They stood in the north pasture in temperatures that iced the hair in a man's beard, and they were warm. The dense coats that looked like too much in autumn became in December exactly the right amount. Their broad, heavy frames retained heat that lighter horses lost through their frames like water through a screen. Nora's feed bills that winter were lower than she had calculated, because the mares needed less feed to maintain their body temperature than she'd expected. And she wrote this discovery in the composition book with 3 underlines and a small star beside it, because she had learned something about the Veldmoor that had direct dollar value. They were cheap to winter. In a country where wintering stock was one of the great costs of farming, cheap to winter was a powerful thing to be. By the second spring, 3 foals were on the ground, and a 4th mare had confirmed in foal, and Nora had a waiting list of farmers who wanted the mare's work in their fields, and a second list, newer and shorter but growing, of people who wanted to know about purchasing stock. She had said nothing publicly about any of this. The operation ran quiet, and Nora ran it that way by instinct, the instinct of a person who has been underestimated enough times to know that the world tends to want a share of your success before it has helped you build it. She kept the books, she kept the confidence, and she got up before first light every morning and worked until the dark came back. The trouble arrived in late April of that second year, wearing a wool suit and a wide smile and a leather case, and his name was Garfield Price. He was the purchasing agent for a firm out of Omaha that dealt in breeding stock, and he had, he said, heard about Nora's mares through the agricultural outfitter who had come the previous fall, and he wanted to discuss an acquisition. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and prosperous-looking, and he sat at Nora's kitchen table with the ease of a man who expected to be comfortable wherever he sat. He said the firm was interested in acquiring the registered mares for their breeding program. He said this was a significant opportunity for someone in her position. He let the words, someone in her position, sit on the table between them without explaining them, which was a particular kind of rudeness that dressed itself as concern. He said the market for draft stock was uncertain, and that a young woman running a one-person operation could not realistically expect to develop the breed further on her own. Developing a breed required capital and connections, and a reputation in the marketplace that, he was careful to say, took time to build, took years, really years, and resources that a person alone might not have. He named a figure for all 8 mares and the 3 foals, $420. He said it the way a man says a number he considers generous. Nora set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. She sat down across from him and looked at him for a moment with the steady quality of a person who is thinking rather than responding. Then she said, "How many registered mares of this breed exist in the world right now outside of this farm?" He said he wasn't sure he had that figure. She said, "You have a figure. You came with a leather case and a number, and you know the count." She watched his face and saw the fraction of a second in which he decided how to proceed. He said, "Very few, I believe, perhaps a dozen in total across several countries." She said, 8 of those dozen are standing in my north pasture. If you acquired them and the foals, you would control the majority of the registered brood mares of an entire breed." She paused. She said, "Is that the sort of opportunity your firm considers significant?" He said, "It is a straightforward agricultural acquisition. The firm does this regularly." She said, "I don't doubt it. But I imagine you do it most easily when the person you're acquiring from doesn't understand what they have." Garfield Price left without his leather case having been opened and did not come back. He did not leave quietly, though. The next week a story ran in the county newspaper, a small story, 4 lines in the notices section, suggesting that the Voss operation was producing unregistered stock and misrepresenting the breed purity of her animals. Nora read it at the feed store, where Mr. Hennessy had tacked it to the board in the way of a man performing a public service, and she folded the paper neatly and set it back on the counter. She drove home and pulled her composition book and found the page where she had written down every registration number for every mare and every foal. The numbers she had confirmed through the Breed Society in the months after she'd bought the animals, because she was a person who confirmed things. She wrote a letter to the county newspaper. She wrote a second letter to the state agricultural office. She wrote a third letter to the Breed Society in Philadelphia, which replied within 2 weeks confirming the registration status of all 11 animals in her care. And she posted that reply on the notice board at the feed store herself, directly below the original item. She did not say anything when she did it. She pinned it up, stepped back to make sure it was straight, and left. Hennessy told 3 people what he'd seen, and those 3 told 6, and Harrow being the size it was, the whole thing had turned around inside of a week. It turned around not because people in Harrow were particularly just. They were ordinary, which is to say, they could be moved when the evidence was plain enough. But because a woman posting documentary proof on a public board is harder to dismiss than a woman arguing with you, and Nora had known this and acted accordingly. The summer of that second year was the summer the drought came. It announced itself in May with a sky too clean and blue, a sky polished like glass, and Otto Brandt remarked on it one Saturday morning with the quiet concern of a man who has seen a sky like that before and did not enjoy the memory. June came without rain. July arrived and stayed, static and furnace brilliant, and the corn in the fields around Harrow began to fail. The creek in Nora's south pasture went dry in the first week of July, which she had budgeted for. She had been putting up water since May, filling the cistern, hauling barrels, and she pulled the mares into the north pasture where the old well still gave. Other farmers around the county were not so prepared. Their crops burned in the ground. Their lighter draft horses, the ones that needed more water per day per pound, were drawing down wells that couldn't be replenished. By August, 3 farms within 5 miles of Harrow had lost teams entirely and faced the fall planting season without the means to break ground. The drought was the crisis. It was also the vindication, though Nora did not call it that, and did not feel what could fairly be called triumph, because the farms that were failing were her neighbors' farms, and she had known some of those families her whole life. What she felt was something more specific and more uncomfortable than triumph, the awareness that she was standing in a position of real advantage over people who had laughed at her, and the immediate understanding that she would not use it that way. She went to Kirshner first. Herman's team was down to 1 horse, and his well was low, and his fall wheat field was still unbroken ground. She drove Elsa and Prospect up in the morning and spent the day breaking his field and asked him $3 for it, which was less than she could have asked and enough to be real. He tried to pay 5. She took 3 and told him the arithmetic made sense for both of them. She went to the Schuster place after that, and to Vandermeer's, and to the 2 families south of town she didn't know well, but whose circumstances she'd heard described at the feed store in the blunt way of frontier people when they are reporting bad luck. They're down to nothing, that's all, just nothing out there. She did not charge them. She broke their ground and helped them plant and drove home at night with her hands so stiff from the lines she had to soak them in the water basin before she could open and close her fingers properly. Pip came on those days and managed the other mares with the competence of a person 3 times his age, and Nora let him, and did not underplay how much it mattered. The town saw what was happening. The town could not help but see it, because in a dry year with failing crops, the sight of 2 immense steady horses working field after field is not a sight that goes unnoticed. People began to come to the fence of the north pasture and look at the mares in a new way. The new way had very little of the old amusement in it. The mares did not change. They were precisely what they had always been, large and plain and mud-colored, wide-footed and short-necked, not handsome by any standard the town had previously applied. But they were working when nothing else was working. They were steady and sound in heat that was felling other animals. They were drinking less and pulling more, and the fields they had worked were going into seed while other fields sat baked and broken, and people noticed this in the slow, reluctant way that people notice things they should have noticed earlier. In September, a man came down from Omaha on the train, not Garfield Price, a different man, a quieter one, representing a cooperative of farmers in the river bottom country to the north, who had been told, he said, by 3 separate people, that there was a woman in Harrow County with a breed of horse that could work the spring clay of the river bottoms in a way no other horse could match. His name was Sorensen. He was a plain-spoken man who smelled pleasantly of river water and spoke the way people speak when they have come a long distance for a specific purpose and are not interested in wasting time. He asked to see the mare's work. Nora showed him. He asked for the foal prices. She named them. He said that was fair. He asked what she would take for the first choice colt from the spring foaling, and she said she was not selling that colt. She was keeping him for the breeding program. He nodded at this as if it were the answer he had expected from a serious person. He said he would take the next available colt at the price she named, and he wanted first consideration on all stock she produced for the following 2 years. He offered to put that in writing. She said she would appreciate it. The letter of agreement they signed at Nora's kitchen table that afternoon was witnessed by Otto Brandt, who had come by for his Saturday visit and found himself unexpectedly useful in a legal capacity, and by Pip, who signed his name in large, careful letters at the bottom and misspelled his surname, the one he used for official purposes, which differed from the name Nora had always known him by, and then signed it again correctly, and nobody mentioned this. Otto shook Sorensen's hand and then shook Nora's and said something in Frisian that Nora by now had come to understand he did when he was satisfied with a situation. She asked him later what it meant. He thought for a moment and said, roughly, "The thing is the thing it is, and the worth is the worth it always was." He said this was a phrase his grandmother had used about the fields, meaning that the land did not change value because people miscounted it, and that the count always came right in the end. Nora wrote it in the composition book, word for word, in the margin beside the first week's feed figures. The county assessor came up the road in October, 6 weeks after Sorensen's visit, his wagon making the familiar ruts in the lane that led to the quarter section her father had left her. By then there were 41 horses. There was the original 8, all 8 of them still healthy, Parliament moving through the pasture with the unhurried authority of a thing that expects to outlast most of the things around it. There were 5 foals on the ground from the spring and summer, and a 6th mare now confirmed. There was the young colt Nora had decided to keep, a heavy, deep-chested bay she had not named yet, and which Pip was campaigning to name Colonel Jr., a campaign she was resisting. There were 12 horses on loan to surrounding farms, working the fall fields, registered to Nora and boarded on neighbor acreage under written agreements she had drawn up herself and had the county clerk review. There were 4 horses she had sold outright to the River Bottom Cooperative at a price she was satisfied with and which Sorensen had not contested. There were 2 horses whose ownership was technically complicated by agreements she had made with the Vandermeer family and the family south of town, agreements that traded field work for grain storage that she needed to winter the rest of the herd through to spring, arrangements that were not entirely legible to a county assessor trained to count animals and assign them dollar figures, but which made a practical sense that Nora could have explained in 3 sentences, and in fact did explain to the assessor, who wrote it down carefully. He stood at her fence that morning in the October fog, the same fog that blurred the backs of 41 horses into something large and warm and improbable, and she watched his hat come off, and she said nothing. She had learned by that 3rd year that the truth of a thing speaks more efficiently than any person speaking on its behalf. She had learned that a thing which is real and valuable and plain in front of a person will, given enough time and enough plainness, do its own arguing. She had not always believed this. There had been nights in the first summer when she had lain awake running the arithmetic and wondering if stillness was a virtue or simply a way of losing slowly. But she believed it now, in the way you believe things you have tested and found to hold. The assessor spent 4 hours on the property. He walked the pastures. He counted animals. He looked at the composition book, which Nora laid open on the kitchen table, the way she laid everything open when the account was one she was proud of, which this one was. He asked about the breed, and she told him its history in the precise and unembellished way she had come to tell it, without defensiveness or advocacy, just the facts of the animal and its origins, and its particular excellences, and how those excellences had turned out to map almost perfectly onto the specific needs of the clay-soiled river-bottom country that ran through the whole middle of Nebraska in a band 3 counties wide. She said, the market was waiting for something it had never been offered. I offered it. The assessor wrote his figures. They were not the figures a neighbor had reported to the county office. They were the figures of a working operation in sound financial standing, and he signed them in that same kitchen, in that same chair, at that same table. And the total he arrived at for the property's assessed value was more than 3 times what it had been the previous year, which was itself more than it had been the year Nora's father died, and the quarter section had passed to her, a young woman alone, with her father's debts and an empty barn, and an idea she couldn't quite put into words but could not let go of. Otto Brandt died the following February, quietly and at home, in a manner that suited him. He left Nora the use of his Saturday mornings in the form of a composition book of his own that his daughter brought over in the spring, 40 years of weather observations and soil notes, and the running record of a farmer who had paid attention to the land, the way some people pay attention to music, finding patterns that the inattentive could not hear. Nora read it over 2 evenings and found, in the 3rd year of entries, a passage in Otto's cramped hand about the Frisian draft horses of his boyhood, the ones that worked the coastal clay fields, the ones that he had recognized in Nora's mares across the fence that June morning. He wrote, "They were not beautiful, and nobody's first choice, but they were there at the end of the long day when the others were finished." He had underlined this, which was not his habit. Then he had written below it, in fresh ink, as if added later, "The worth is the worth it always was." He had known the aphorism was true because he had seen it proven in the fields of his youth, and then, at 71 years old, seen it proven again from the fence line of a neighbor's quarter section in Nebraska. The land does not change its count. The worth is the worth it always was. It only waits for someone patient enough to find it, and stubborn enough not to put it down. Nora kept the composition books, both of them hers and Otto's, on the shelf above the kitchen table, next to the letter from the Breed Society confirming 12 registrations and the agreement with the River Bottom Cooperative and the assessor's signed figures. She kept them there where she could see them when she sat down to eat, which she now did sitting, because she had time for it. Pip was there most days, and he was 14 now, and could manage the morning feeding for the horses with his eyes closed. And Parliament, who had once stood in the fog with the bearing of something that expected to outlast everything, was still standing, still moving through the north pasture with that unhurried dignity, the oldest registered mare of her breed in the country, possibly in the world, and still in the way of the Veldmoor, which was the way of a patient and particular kind of strength, still in foal. There are things that look worthless and are not. There are breeds of knowledge and of creature and of land that go unseen for long years, because the eye looking at them is trained to see something else. The town of Harrow had been trained in the way of most towns to see value in the things that were already valued and failure in the things that were not. They had looked at 8 mud-colored mares, and they had been wrong, which is not a dishonor exactly. Being wrong is an ordinary condition, no more shameful in a town than in a person. The dishonor is in refusing to look again when the evidence shifts. Most of Harrow looked again. They looked at the fields that had been worked in the drought year and the fields that had not. And they looked at the waiting list on the board at Nora Voss's fence. And they looked at Nora Voss herself, who was 26 years old now and no longer stood at fences the way she had stood at the Pell estate fence for 6 years, watching, keeping her own counsel, waiting to be sure. She still rose before first light. She still worked with her hands until they went rough as bark. But she had learned to speak, and when she spoke, even the men at the feed store had the good manners to stop talking and listen. She had not become a different person. She was entirely the same person. It was only that the world had come around to her particular measure, and found, as the land does not lie and the math does not lie, that the number had always been correct.